Thank you, Mr. Secretary. Elise Labbick, good to see you. You spoke about your conversation with Foreign Minister Lavrov. Could you talk about your discussions about Ukraine? There are many reports that the Russians are moving heavy weaponry across the border into Ukraine. There have been numerous violations of the Minsk agreement, and there's been some talk that the U.S. is preparing additional sanctions along with the Europeans. It seems as if President Putin has decided that he can absorb the costs of the current status quo. So how do you change and get the Russians to withdraw their troops, withdraw their support for the Russian-backed separatists, or are you planning additional punitive measures? Thank you.
Well, thank you, Elise, and thanks for your warm comments. I appreciate it. Look, we discussed this at some length yesterday, of course. And I made it very clear that the United States and European capacity to try to move forward with respect to sanctions relief is fully dependent on the implementation of the Minsk agreements. Now, there have been several meetings in the last days of the working groups and the trilateral group, which have been a little bit more productive than meetings heretofore, and a little bit of discipline has entered into the elections discussion with respect to the separatists. And I made it very clear to Foreign Minister Lavrov, and I think, you know, it wasn't, really it was my emphasizing it, because I think he understands and accepts the idea that the working groups are the key to making Minsk happen. Now, the Russians always raise counter initiatives by the Ukrainians, which they suggest are causing the separatists to shell and to engage in further military activity. And frankly, you just sort of get trapped in a rabbit's hole if you start discussing who did what, when, and how. And so we really tried to focus on how do we move from here forward. And I made it very, very clear. And he accepted the idea that there needs to be less fighting and more negotiating and more movement with respect to the Minsk implementation process. Toria Nuland will be over visiting some folks in the region shortly, today, tomorrow, the next days. We are going to continue to be putting pressure on the process of the working groups to be able to more fully implement Minsk. And I made it, you know, as clear as I possibly can that in the absence of a reduction in the hostilities and in the absence of further progress of the implementation, Europe and the United States are going to be united in a rollover of the current level of sanctions, certainly, and whether or not more comes depends on what happens on the ground. Foreign Minister Lavrov indicated to me that they want the Minsk implementation, that they do believe that is the way to resolve this. But obviously, even as we've heard that before, we've also seen Russian activities that further support the separatists in ways that are not productive. I called that to his attention, and we'll see whether or not in the next days there can be progress made and whether or not the Minsk process actually takes greater hold through the working groups and the OSCE presence and oversight, and ultimately through the political pieces that need to be achieved on both sides in order to have an election and begin to get the autonomy, the individual autonomy steps in place that have been at the heart of the separatist demands and of the Ukrainian proffers with respect to a resolution. So if those things happen, there's a way forward. If they don't happen, if President Putin chooses to play a double game and continues to allow the separatists to press forward, then obviously we have a very big challenge ahead of us.
Okay, this will have to be the last question, Leslie.